All right, so today we're going to talk about currency exchange. And we're going to be exchanging Canadian dollars for some other country's money. So a foreign country's money, we're going to purchase that. These rates are old, as I said, but just know that the calculations would be done the same way. Okay? So currency just represents the unit of money that each of these countries of the world use. Okay? Not every country has the same currency. Like in Australia, they use dollars, but it's Australian dollars. Germany uses the euro. Okay? Japan uses yen. Scotland uses the pound. Singapore has a dollar as well. Switzerland uses a franc. Egypt uses the pound. Okay, a lot of those countries now probably use the euro. But we're going to start talking about buying rates and selling rates. And you want to think about the bank's perspective. So the bank is buying from you, you would use the buying rate. So think about that transaction. If the bank's buying from you, you're actually selling to the bank. So a lot of times students get confused in this unit because it'll say, if you want to sell Danish kroners to the bank, the student thinks they have to use the selling rate. But if you think about that transaction from the bank's perspective, if you're selling, what's the bank doing? Buying. You need to use the buying rate. If you're buying euros from the bank, what's the bank doing? It's selling, so you need to use the selling rate in that situation. Okay, and those rates are constantly changing. They're changing daily. The process in this unit is the same as what we've been doing throughout this proportional reasoning section. You're going to set up a ratio or a rate, okay? And you're going to then set up a proportion. You'll cross multiply and divide. And the template in this situation will look like so. You're going to have 1 over the rate, and it's going to equal the foreign amount over the Canadian amount. We're going to always think about it in terms of Canadian dollars. Most of our examples will follow that route. Okay? Now this rate could be buying or selling. That's the confusing part. The exchange rate. So here's the price of one country's currency in terms of another nation. All right, this is comparing Canadian dollars to US dollars. Look at this here. 1 Canadian dollar is equal to 1.0146 American dollars. Is that current? Like, is our dollar worth the same as an American dollar right now? Absolutely not. This is old, okay? Old information. Right now, the Canadian dollar's only worth about 70 cents American. So it's 1 over the rate equals the foreign over the Canadian. And this is kind of the key. You have to think about what's happening from the bank's perspective. So if the bank is buying, you'd use the buying rate. If the bank is selling, you'd use the selling rate. So here's your first example. It says on a specific date, the selling rate for the Danish kroner compared to the Canadian dollar is 0.221778. How many kroner will you receive for 500 Canadian dollars? You're going to set it up. So what am I actually asked to figure out in this question? I want to know how many Danish kroner I'll receive. So I'm going to say, let X equal the number of kroner. So think about this. I'm actually buying Danish kroner. What does that mean the bank is doing? Selling. So this right here is actually a selling rate. There was no real mystery in this question because they only gave me the one rate. But To answer this question properly, I'm going to have to fill this proportion in. I would write 1 over, in this case, the selling rate. So what am I going to put underneath this? That decimal, 0.221778. It is going to equal, what will I fill up top in place of the kroner? X, that's the unknown. That's what we're looking for. And what will I fill in the bottom? 500 Canadian dollars. Okay? And don't think of this as any different than the previous questions you were just doing, like the ones you were just doing on the quiz. What should you do in this situation? Cross multiply. Start at the variable, multiply it by the decimal. I've got 0.221778. X equals, don't forget to write your equal sign, 1 times 500 is 500. What should you do from here? Yeah, I'm going to divide, like, if that said 5x, I'd divide both sides by 5. If it said 13x, I'd divide both sides by 13. Just because it's a weird decimal doesn't change my mathematical process. I am going to divide both sides by 0.221778. What would that leave on this side? X. And 500, if I do that, 500 divided by 0.221778, I get 2,254. And are you okay if I round it to the nearest hundred? 0.51 kroner. And that's what it should say under here. You will receive 2,254.51 kroner for 500 Canadian dollars. So it's really no different than what we were doing. The exception or the confusing part in this section is actually figuring out what rate to use and why. What's the way around that, or what's the solution to that problem? You always have to think from whose perspective? The bank's perspective. Cool? Next question. Here we go. On the same day as the previous example. So we're still talking about I converted 500 Canadian dollars for 2,254.51 Danish kroner. The buying rate for kroner was, so this one straight up tells me it's a buying rate, 0.210778. So if after purchasing your kroner, you decided not to go to Denmark, something happened, okay, something really important came up, or you couldn't miss it, and you had to cancel your trip to Denmark. And you didn't have traveler's insurance, so now you have all these Danish kroner. You have 2,254.51 Danish kroner, which are no good to you here. Okay, you're not going to go into the grocery store and start spending your kroners. What are you going to have to do with that? You're going to have to go back to the bank and exchange it for Canadian dollars. So you're going to have to try and sell those Danish kroner back to the bank. If you're selling them to the bank, what's the bank actually doing? Buying. So this situation is where I need to go 1 over the buying rate. So this time I'm going to use the buying rate. And can you fill this in on your sheet? It's going to equal your foreign amount over your Canadian amount. So when I fill this in, I'm going to write 1 over. What should I put for the buying rate? 0.210778. And it's going to equal, how many kroner did I have? Think of the previous example. How many kroner did I have? 2,254.51. So I have to use that number 2,254.51 on top of what? X. Because, I kind of jumped the gun on you here, I was looking to sell the Danish kroner back, so I need to know how much Canadian dollars I would get. And then the question actually wants to know how much money I'd lose. How do I figure this out? I'm going to cross multiply. I would start at the variable X, multiply it by 1, that gives you X. And then I'm going to go 2254.51 times 0.210778. Was that the, yeah. And I get $475.20. Okay, that's what it should say. Oh, undo that. How would you figure out how much money you lost? Yeah, if you started with $500 and after canceling your trip, you now only have $475.20, you're going to end up losing, I would subtract $475.20 from $500. So I'm going to lose about $25. In fact, I'd lose $24.80. Okay? And that's because you had to cancel your trip to Denmark. Cool? The bank is going to make some money on that transaction. The bank's always going to come ahead. Now, ideally, you should just be able to walk back down to the bank, take your Danish kroners, and get your $500 back. Banks are greasy like that. I'd like you to try these two questions for homework. Okay? You want to calculate the amount of money you would receive in Canadian dollars if you sold 4,500 Kenya shillings to the bank. Now, if you're selling, folks, what's the bank doing? You need to use the buying rate. And in the next one, Arnold is making a movie in Thailand. His travel allowance is $3,000. How much money will he have in baht? You're looking to buy baht. That is the currency in Thailand. So for this one, you'd use the selling rate. Now, where do you get those numbers from? Where do you get the buying rate for Kenya and the selling rate for Thailand? Yeah, on the handout I gave you. Okay? So the handout I gave you, that's not, thought I had a copy of it. Use the tables that I gave you. So you can try these for your homework. Cool?